All right. Well, we're back again. Larry, how are you today?
Fantastic, Shad. Good to see you back in the
Good to
studio.
see you as usual. So we are back again in the studio, this time with another version of our Inspirational Leaders series. And today we have a very prestigious guest, Mr. Andrew Soren. So I'm going to let you kick off the introduction and we'll just jump right into our Inspirational Leaders interview.
Excellent. Welcome, Andrew. Welcome to the Lean In Leaders, Inspirational Leaders podcast. We are thrilled to have you.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So let's tell the audience a little bit about Andrew Soren. Andrew is the founder and CEO of Eudaimonic by Design, which is a global network of facilitators, coaches, and advisors who share a passion for well-being and believe that organizations must be designed to enable that well-being. For the past 25 years, Andrew has worked with some of the most recognized brands, nonprofits, and public sector teams to co-create values-based culture. So Andrew is a regular writer and speaker about how to apply the science of well-being at work. Since 2013, Andrew has been part of the instructional team at the University of Pennsylvania. Internationally renowned, it is an internationally renowned Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program. It's one of the most prestigious positive psychology programs. Andrew is a member of the board of International Positive Psychology Association and was the chair of its 8th World Congress on Positive Psychology held in Vancouver, Canada, just last year about this time, right? He was a senior advisor in governance, culture, and leadership at LRN, and he spent 13 years at BMO Financial Group, one of Canada's largest banks, where he led strategy in both marketing and human resources. Andrew is a ICF certified coach through Coactive Training Institute, which is formerly Coaches Training Institute. And Andrew is residing in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. Andrew, again, it's a pleasure to have you with Shad and I today in the studio. So
Thanks, Larry.
we look forward to learning a lot, and we think our listeners are going to learn a lot.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what excites us the most, to be honest with you. You know, we are learning geeks, but we want to share. So let's get right into it. Positive psychology is a big part of your life and what you do. And as though we talk a lot about it on Lean In Leaders, we would love for you to get into what it really is, not just the constructs, but talk about positive psychology in general, just anything that you think would help us get a better grounding in the discipline.
Sure. This field of positive psychology is this really interesting field. It's, it's been around in many ways for thousands of years, one could say. The idea of what positive psychology is all about, and there's lots of synonyms for it. We could be calling it the science of well-being, the science of human flourishing. But positive psychology is really the study of what goes right with us. And it's interesting that it has probably in the last 25 years, it has really come into its own as a bit of a movement within psychology more broadly. And a lot of that happened because, people have been thinking about what goes right with us for as long as they've been thinking about, the idea of how people think, feel, and do. And yet for a whole bunch of reasons, especially over the course of the 20th century, most of psychology really veered towards all the things that are wrong with us. Like you think of a psychologist and you think, I go to a psychologist to get fixed. I go to a psychologist because there's something, because I have a lot of ill being in some way, shape, or form. I mean, the dominant textbook of psychology is the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses. And psychology is really good at telling us with a lot of rigor and a lot of precision all of the things that might potentially go wrong with the way that we think, feel, and do. And positive psychology really as a movement emerged really right at the very end of the 20th century. Martin Seligman is often kind of described as a bit of a father of this movement because at the time he was the president of the APA, the American Psychological Association. And as part of his presidential address, he declared, psychology's kind of lost its way. We focused so much on what's wrong with us that we've actually lost sight of using the same rigor, the same science, the same approach to try to explore the things that are right with us. And so that's really what positive psychology tries to do. And in many ways, it's an umbrella for the study of all of those things that really make life worth living. That's my short answer to the question.
So you want to hear how I learned about positive psychology before I entered my program? I was driving to a client, and this isn't the only thing I was doing in the organization, but I was preparing to deliver a presentation on leadership. I'm driving from New Jersey to Maryland, so I had some good windshield time. I don't even remember what program I was listening to on Sirius XM, but they talked about someone was being interviewed like this, and they said the words, and you're going to know exactly where I'm going with this. They said, it's called Hunt the Good Stuff. And it went, what? What is that? It sounds exciting. It sounds like you're looking for the good instead of the bad. And it's like, what is that? And I don't even know who it was, but as they started talking and they said positive psychology, before I presented, I made sure when I got to Maryland, I had some time, discretionary time. I started looking up Hunt the Good Stuff, and there it is. Marty Seligman, the MAP program, the application of that for PTSD in the military. And I'm like, I've got to get more of this. That's how I was introduced to positive psychology. And that was, I think, in 2014. So, it was just, I was fascinated by it. That's why when I met you, I was like, we've got to talk about this with Chad and our listeners in more detail. So that is awesome. Now, and again, really interesting that you studied under the program that Marty Seligman, the father of positive psychology, right in at U of P. So that's just, I think, incredibly exciting to think that you had that experience. One of the things that is fundamental to Seligman's introduction and evolution of positive psychology is something that he calls PERMA, which is a framework. Could you talk to us in as much detail as you would like about what PERMA is and what it means? Because if our listeners can get that, I think they'll get more of the essence of positive psychology.
Yeah, sure, of course. PERMA is Seligman's way of really, in many ways, describing the greatest hits of this positive psychology movement. I think that's probably the best way that you could describe PERMA. He first talked about it when he wrote his book, which is called Flourish, which he published just before you were finding out about Hunt the Good Stuff back in 2011. And Flourish is if anybody's listening to this and wants to really dig into, in a relatively popular press kind of a way, accessible way, what the foundations of positive psychology are all about. Flourish is a great book to be able to read. But basically, Flourish is organized in these sections around these 5 greatest hits of positive psychology. The first really being about P for positive emotions. And so there's been tons of research. As I said, there's been tons of research on emotions throughout the history of psychology, but most of that research is really focused on the negative emotions and negative affect. There's been an increasing amount of research on positive emotions. Everything from hope and joy and gratitude, which is what Hunt the Good Stuff is all about, to optimism, to love, to curiosity, to calm, these kind of calm, positive serenity emotions. There's been increasingly more and more research about the value of positive emotions in our lives. And the research, if I were to give, I'll probably try to give, one major researcher for each one of these elements who's done the most work in this regard would be a woman named Barb Fredrickson. And she's written the most about the idea that when we experience positive emotions, literally we have this whole, what she describes, broaden and build reaction in our brains and in our bodies. Like we literally see more when we experience these positive emotions. We hear more, we taste more, we perceive more, we're more creative, we have better relationships. We literally broaden our horizons, and those positive emotions release all sorts of oxytocins, and they reduce our vagal tone. They change our parasympathetic nervous system. There's all sorts of physical things that happen when we experience those positive emotions that make us want to replicate them, which means we build, which means that when we experience positive emotions, we really create upward spirals of what she describes positivity resonance. And so that's just an example of a huge amount of body of research. That's just that P of PERMA around positive emotions and how important that is for our well-being. E. Now, next we've got E. E is for engagement. And engagement's all about how we get lost in flow. You can see maybe if you're watching this on video that there's a kind of giant sign behind me for flow. And flow is the work of a guy named Mike Csikszentmihalyi, who passed away a few years ago, but was an extraordinary researcher, predominantly in creativity. And his whole entire focus was around the ways in which when we experience certain kinds of activities, specifically activities that find this perfect intersection point between skill and challenge, this magical thing happens. This magical thing where we kind of lose a sense of self. We lose a sense of time. We look at our watch. We're like, oh my God, how did it become midnight already? And we perform in extraordinary ways when we fall into these states like flow, these flow-like states. And so the E for engagement really talks about a huge body of research that looks at the ways in which we can seek engagement, both personally, both professionally, in different kinds of contexts and different domains, and the ways in which that has a profound impact on our lives.
That's great.
Okay, the R. R is for relationships, and relationships are really the glue of positive psychology. One of the other, real founders of the field, his name was Chris Peterson. He used to say that if you boiled all of the research of positive psychology down to one kind of hashtag, it would be other people matter. And it's so true for when it comes to our well-being, when it comes to our resilience, when it comes to our happiness, the capacity for relationships, social support to be a foundation for our experiences is really everything. And there's been so much research in this regard that I think is extremely useful. And especially for folks who are in leadership positions listening to this, there's been a lot of research about the ways in which we can build high quality connections at work in these really quick, momentary, just kind of moments of time in work and interactions that we have, whether they're with customers, whether they're with clients and patients, or with each other, with bosses, with direct reports. We can, in just mere seconds, build these connections of really high mutuality, really respectful engagement, real sense of energy and possibility and excitement and trust, almost instantaneously if we're really deliberate about how we do that. And when we do, it transforms the whole entire relationship. It transforms the whole entire way in which we approach things. So the power of relationships. Okay, M, we're getting close there. M is all about meaning and purpose. And meaning, this is honestly the thing that got me really most excited about positive psychology as a discipline. I've always been really interested in the topic of meaning. And in many ways, this work goes back all the way to folks like Viktor Frankl, who was a survivor of the Second World War, of Auschwitz, and a psychiatrist, and really trying to understand what was the difference between the people who were able to survive a concentration camp experience and those who couldn't. And for him, so much of that was ultimately about trying to find a sense of meaning and purpose in suffering. And that sense of understanding the power that meaning has in our lives has really extended throughout the last 100 years to help us understand the importance of really exploring meaning in our lives. I specifically focus a lot on meaningful work and the ways in which meaningful work plays a huge role in our lives and has all sorts of both positive and potentially negative impacts, dark sides as well. But within specifically the meaning literature, there's really, three ways of thinking about it. One is about a sense of purpose. What animates? What are the big life goals that we have? a sense of significance. What's actually important to us? What are the important values that we have? How do we ultimately lean into a sense of feeling like we matter in the world? And then ultimately coherence. How do we try to experience things that close the gap between the things that we care about and the reality that we have? So that's just, that's work by a guy named Mike Steeker, but just one example of now a huge body of research that exists around meaning and purpose in our lives. The last one with a caveat, because now there's other people who are like, it's PERMA plus 4. So I won't go there, but I'll get to the A at least. So the A has different labels to it. It was originally accomplishment or achievement, actually. Achievement was the first label that Seligman used. He switched it eventually to accomplishment. And I would say that if you asked him today, he'd probably say it's actually more about agency. But the reality is that this sense of accomplishment is a really important piece of our lives. It's especially important, I would say, in more kind of Western contexts in the world. But we derive a tremendous sense of well-being from being able to check things off, to be able to literally say that we got something done, and to be able to do that well. I mean, it's a huge part of what resilience is all about. It's a huge part of just what it means to get through the day. And there's a lot of research in this regard. I'll point in this particular regard to a woman named Teresa Amabile, another great creativity researcher who wound up in all of her research around creativity, recognizing that one of the most important aspects of innovation and creativity was the idea of progress. When we feel like we're making progress, we really have a heightened sense of a sense of accomplishment, of pride, of ultimately just feeling like, wow, this was a good day. And so how do we think about all of the different ways in which we can create progress in our lives and for others, and really kind of oil the wheels of being able to think about the ways that we can do that?
Yeah, I don't care who you are. We all love to check a box off or put a strike through on a list of things we have to do. I know it's so much bigger than that when you talk about this in the relation to PERMA, but there's chemical reactions that are happening when we're doing this, which is really integral to the science of positive psychology. So thank you for explaining PERMA. Hopefully that was well absorbed by everyone. You did a great job just laying that out, and that's central to positive psychology. So thanks for that.
So a couple thoughts or questions just to kind of start tying this back into our leadership stuff. In that sense of accomplishment or achievement, agency, has research been done? Because I think that's a fascinating concept that, just making progress shows this positive emotion, positive psychology, right? Has research quantified what progress really looks like? In other words, how much progress is progress? And I have a follow-up to where you take that.
Yeah, it's a good question that I don't have a great answer to. I'm sure that there are people who could do a much better job of answering it than me. But I would say that, Teresa's work, Amabile's work would suggest that it doesn't need to be massive.
Yeah.
And sometimes, there's a guy whose name is, Albert Bandura, who spent his career studying the idea of self-efficacy, or the belief that you can do something, right? This idea of like, is it Thomas the Tank? I think I can. I think I can. That belief, right? Like that not the actual skill that you can do something, but the belief that you're capable of doing something is such an important thing for us. It's such an important thing for leadership too. Like, to be a leader, you need to have self-efficacy, but in many ways, your job as a leader is to build self-efficacy in other people. And what Bandura would say is that you don't need to have accomplished extraordinary things to have self-efficacy. Often it's actually just being able to look back and say, you know what, I can break this thing down into smaller bits and make that progress, and that will build self-efficacy. Or I can look back and say, hey, I've done things that are a little bit like this. And so that gives me, again, the idea of efficacy, this kind of self-confidence to be able to try something new.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely kind of where I was leaning towards, and I think you've probably seen this throughout your coaching career, and I see this with the clients I work with. Oftentimes, they look at progress as this vast, grand, overarching goal, and it becomes overwhelming and daunting, and I can never get there, right? And so we break it down to say, hey, just give yourself grace. Hence the name our 1% Studio, right? We don't have to get this podcast, we don't have to get life exactly right. But if we contribute just one little thing different, one little thing better, one little thought out of this 20-minute listen, that's positive progress. And if we can take that and build on it every day, boy, that incremental gain leads you to that overarching goal. So, I mean, I love that idea of just progress is progress, and just that self-efficacy, that belief that you can actually make progress can make a difference for you as a person and henceforth as a leader. I think that's fantastic.
And of course, there's all sorts of skills, right? Like and this is again a great thing that positive psychology helps us understand is, what are the things that are actually really important in that sense of progress? And they're very, I mean, I talked a little bit about self-efficacy, but there's also a sense of hope, right? Like that there's a lot of study within positive psychology about optimism and hope. And those two things are really important, and they're different. Right? Like optimism is really about being able to look into the future and see good things as possible. But hope is about saying, I can see those good things in the future, and I know that I have a role to be able to play in them. So hope,
that's powerful.
And like hope theory is really about being able to have a goal that you're moving towards. So, right. So to what you just described, like you do need to have a goal that is important. And the important part is critical, because there's really two, beyond the goal, two really critical pieces to hope. One is willpower, which is, am I going to be motivated to work on that goal? And the other is way power, which is, do I know what the pathways are to be able to accomplish that goal? Yeah. And do I know about the obstacles that are inevitably going to hit me as I try to attain that goal, especially the obstacles that are personal obstacles. I mean, there's a world of obstacles outside of myself that I can't control, right? But can I understand enough of the ways that I'm going to get in my own way to anticipate what those pathways should be? And that's real important skills. Again, skills that like a leader needs to be able to know and understand, to be able to give other people a sense of hope that they can actually accomplish something.
Andrew, just curious. So I'm familiar with pathway to agency, willpower, way power, and hope theory. And I'm curious, you mentioned that the A in PERMA went from achievement and accomplishment. I know it pivoted a couple of times, and I wasn't aware of that. It may have morphed now into agency. And I know that PsyCap is inclusive of hope and optimism and self-efficacy and resilience. How much of what's happened around goal theory is potentially influencing the A in PERMA, the morph into agency? Like what? Because I'm just curious, like how did that pivot again?
Yeah. So I'm actually curious. I don't, to be honest, I don't know whether Seligman would say this yet, but I would say that he's focused very much at this stage of his life around this topic of agency. And I think that he believes that in many ways, a summation of all of the work that he has tried to do in his life really revolves around this idea of agency. And he would define agency as really about three major things. One is optimism. And when he's talking about optimism, he's really talking about, how do I explain things? Like, how do I explain good things that happen to me? How do I explain bad things that happen to me? So this idea of an explanatory style, but optimism being one really, really important part of it. Another piece of it is efficacy, which we've just talked about, which is, not only do I explain things, but I also believe that I can achieve things as part of agency. And then the third is imagination or future mindedness, which is really about, it's pretty similar to what we were just talking about around hope theory, which is like, can I imagine into the future the thing that I ultimately want to have agency around? So all of this, again, very similar. Like we could call it PsyCap. We could call it, psychological capital is what PsyCap stands for. We could call it hope. We could call it efficacy. We could call it optimism. Like there's these different ways of being able to say, this whole entire world of things that's around goal directedness, and then trying to figure out what are the psychological resources that I need to be able to accomplish that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Nice. So talk a little bit, Andrew, about how you've had a really nice history in leadership and kind of senior positions. And how did you personally start to use positive psychology and some of the tools, ideas in your leadership career?
I think the first, the reason I got into positive psychology to begin with was because I was working in leadership development at a bank. And for me, the thing that always struck me was that the way that we talked about leadership really seemed to ignore the fact that we were leading humans.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe leading resources, but not necessarily leading humans. And so for me, the idea of studying positive psychology was all about how can we bring more rigor to this idea of ultimately prioritizing the human in leadership. And I would say that is absolutely how I have always thought about the integration of positive psychology into the space of leadership. I mean, every single aspect of PERMA that we just walked through would be an opportunity to think differently about what are the behaviors of leaders that would be required to enable those things. I mean, those things don't just happen by magic. We all have elements of PERMA in our lives, but if we thought about leadership as ultimately being something that was about enabling or empowering PERMA and others, what would be the skills, the capabilities, the mindsets that I would need as a leader to be able to do that? And those are things that are often not trained in our leadership programs. They're rarely things that you learn about in an MBA program. And there's a lot of snake oil out there about what those things can and should be. So it's like, what does the science actually tell us about that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Very nice. I think you hear people oftentimes talk about, the catchphrase right now is emotional intelligence, right? That for the last 6 or 7 years, we talk about emotional intelligence all the time. And people refer to those, which is mind numbing to me when we talk in leadership circles. They talk about those as soft skills.
We don't use that term anymore.
I know, but and I'm like, no, these are like the core skills to being a good leader, right? Everybody else can yell at somebody and tell them to do something. Being able to empower, engage, and inspire others to see that vision and that own self-efficacy that's the power of being a leader. So if you were to say, or if I were to ask you, how would you coach a leader to start to apply some of these concepts if they're not familiar with PERMA or the concepts of positive psychology?
Yeah, the first thing that I would say, and this is true of many ways of thinking about leadership development, is that you probably need to start with yourself. So apply PERMA to your own life. And think about your word. You can actually deconstruct a bit of your job, do a little bit of an audit. There's a wonderful tool called the Wheel of Life tool, which kind of allows you to be able to take if you kind of took a circle and divided it up into 5 pies, and each one of those slices could be one of those elements of PERMA, and just score yourself on a kind of weekly basis. Look back over the last couple of weeks and say, how much positive emotion in general have I felt between 0 and 10 over the last couple of weeks? How much engagement, how much positive relationships, how much meaning, how much of a sense of accomplishment or agency have I felt over the last couple of weeks? You'll pretty quickly get a view of kind of what your own reality is. And you can spend a little bit of time thinking about, hey, what could I do to, first of all, harness my strengths? Like, where is the opportunity and how can I lean into that a little bit more? Like, that's great. Like, how can that help me? But also, where are my gaps? Where's my weakness here? And what would it mean for me to think a little bit more about finding a bit more meaning or working a little bit harder at the relationships? But I would definitely start with the I.
Yeah. And Shad, a couple weeks ago, we talked about the wellness wheel that you talked about.
Yeah.
You just talked about this life wheel, and there's a myriad of capabilities, skills, and mindsets that leaders can develop. But the one thing that's central to everything we just talked about, and we always talk about, is one of the things a leader has to do is create the space to reflect. Because if you don't do that, you can't apply anything. So we're always reminding people, you literally need to create the space. There's a really good book called Creating the Space to Lead by a woman named Janice Martirano. And I've never read the full book, even though I have 20 of them sitting on the bookshelf because I was using them at one point. But the idea of creating this space to lead signals to you that if you don't take time to reflect, it's really hard to improve yourself. It's really hard to pivot, and it's really hard to realign when you derail. So, and even avoid derailing. So I just think that's so central to everything you're talking about too. Space and reflection.
Beyond that, after the self-awareness piece, after that personal pause and reflection, I think then the next question is, how am I creating the conditions again for others to be able to do these things?
That's huge. Yeah.
And I think that there's different ways of being able to think about that. I mean, certainly there's opportunities to think about that in kind of one-on-one relationships, to kind of go through your own direct reports and to do that to help your direct reports do that kind of an exercise, to spend some time talking about these things and thinking about them. But I think that there's even possibly a more important role that we can play as leaders, which is to really think about how we do work. I think it's too easy to sometimes let this positive psychology stuff or these individual interventions be the way that we tackle it, without actually taking a step back and saying, what's the environment that we're creating around here? What are the nature of the goals that we're actually setting? And are those goals actually meaningful? Mm-hmm. Are the goals that we're setting as a team ultimately creating the possibility for good relationships or for a sense of accomplishment? How am I recognizing those steps in the right direction in my team meetings or in the ways and the natural rhythms that we have as an organization? Am I creating the capacity for people to find flow and real engagement in their work? Am I helping them ultimately understand the challenge and skill that they're bringing to any specific task that they might be working on? Mm-hmm. And what's the role that we have, as a team, as a function, in creating positive emotions around here? Are we creating space for, hope and curiosity and optimism, of love in various ways? We're also making space for the negative emotion too, and being able to hold that in a gentle way, that's ultimately about self-compassion and things like that. I think that those kinds of enabling actions are the things that leaders can really do to make a difference around this.
Yeah, that's very powerful, because that's really, it's less about you as the leader, and it's more about that servant leadership, or whatever you want to call it, about leading others to that place, right? And when you do that fulfills that whole sense of meaning, that sense of purpose, I think, for people who truly want to be leaders. Yeah. So I guess that may be a nice segue. Tell us a little bit about Eudaimonic by Design. And I'm assuming that's a lot of what you do in your organization. So give us a little bit of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the name. So eudaimonic, eudaimonia is one of the ways that we can describe everything that we've just been talking about. So, a synonym to positive psychology would be eudaimonia. It's Greek, ancient Greek is the etymology of the word. Aristotle would have used it to describe what happiness was. So if you were looking at the ancient Greeks and you wanted to find a synonym or a translation of well-being or happiness or flourishing, many would say that eudaimonia is the answer. But it's an interesting idea. The root of the word is eu is good, and daimon is about a sense of spirit that lives within all of us. So the idea that what well-being actually is this good spirit, this potential that lives within all of us, that has the capacity to do amazing, extraordinary, important, ethical, excellent things in the world. And our job, what eudaimonic living is all about, is trying to figure out, how am I working every single day to try to bring the best of myself to do those hard and difficult things. And that if I do that every day, it's probably not always going to be fun. It's probably not always going to be happy making, but that's a good life. Doing that every single day and getting to the end of your life and looking backwards and said, I tried the best to do important and hard things, and I brought the best of myself to do it. Probably, a good bet that will be a life well lived. And so I'm really interested. I've always believed that way of thinking about well-being is really at the core of what positive psychology is about, but it's also at the core of what high performance in an organization is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And that if you wanted, if you really wanted high performance, which was certainly something that at the bank that I used to work at, we talked about all the time, that aiming for eudaimonia in your workforce probably be a pretty good bet. Like if every single person in your organization was giving their all, trying to bring the very best of themselves to do difficult and important, ethical, excellent, engaged things, like pretty good recipe for what success is going to look like. And certainly the bank that I worked for wasn't designed that way. Most organizations are not designed to allow people to be their most eudaimonic selves. And so what we try to do at Eudaimonic by Design is to say, okay, let's peel back the layers of how we design organizations, of how we design HR structures, of how we think about culture, of how we think about leadership, and say, what would those things need to be like if we actually wanted to create the conditions for eudaimonia at work?
Wow. That goes back to what you described earlier, the way you kind of backed into the psychological constructs and said, how do we create more of that? It was like almost like this reverse gearing into it instead of getting like you began with the end in mind.
That's
the way
right.
You described it. That's how you just described this too. So it's fascinating. It really is.
Yeah.
It's inspiring too. And the word I thought of was like, if we all operate with integrity and we operate with the idea of like in the moment being our best and not just, striving for it, but being it along the way. That's what I felt as you were describing that. It also takes some pressure off and doesn't make you feel like it's only okay if it's perfect.
Totally. Because it's never going to be perfect.
Right.
What's like, perfect? I think that one of the things about eudaimonia is an acceptance of imperfection. The desire to try to relentlessly, continuously, as a practice, try to make tomorrow a little bit better than today was.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Very cool. Any parting thoughts as we kind of wrap this a little bit? I think it would be great, Andrew. We'd love to have you back and spend, I agree, we could spend an hour on each one of these. I'm not sure everybody else would like it, but I'd love it. But any other parting thoughts for our folks and knowing kind of our listener viewership is these leaders looking to enhance personal life and enhance leadership skills. Any parting thoughts for them on where they go tomorrow with this?
Yeah, I guess the last thing that I would say, maybe this is like the start of our next conversation, is that when it comes to any of these aspects of positive psychology, the hard and important part of doing the work is trying to find the sweet spot. Like you can take any one of these elements too far. You can have too much positive emotion in an organization. You can create toxic positivity. You can create cruel optimism in an organization. And so to be wedded to a kind of reality in the way that we take this work forward and to recognize, we might aspire and be really, inspired to have certain aspirations around this stuff. But we also have to be very cognizant of the realities that we all face. Mm-hmm. We have to dance between inspiration and reality all the time. And that means, understanding that all of this stuff is contextual, that I might want to bring more meaning, but there also might be times when I actually want to take my foot off the brake and have even less meaning. There might be times when I'm driving towards more and more accomplishment. There might also be times when it's okay to just relax and just appreciate kind of where we are as opposed to have a go kind of mentality.
Sure.
So I guess that would be the thing that I would encourage.
In short,
everyone
that
to
introspection to kind of feel intuitively where you need to be at this moment and adjust.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. Andrew, thank you so much. We are grateful for you spending time with us. I'm glad we were introduced to you, and just really, really grateful for the time. I think our listeners will take a lot away from the conversation.
Well, thank you both. Thank you both for the very good work that you're trying to do and ultimately bringing wisdom to your listeners. So thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. So as always, we encourage you, if you got to this point, we thank you for listening, following, and we encourage you to subscribe, share. I think from Andrew's presentation, our conversations today, this is something that everybody can use. So play it forward a little bit. That's really going to help you and your partners and your peers. So like us, share, tune in again. And as we always do, we encourage you to always lean in, leaders.
I'm the anomaly, the 1% warrior. I'm the anomaly, the one they write the story for. I'm the anomaly, the 1% warrior. I'm the anomaly, the one they write the story for. I'm the anomaly, I'm the anomaly. I'm the anomaly. I'm the anomaly. I'm the anomaly. See, I'm the oddity. Welcome to my odyssey. I can't follow moles, so I don't do pottery.